lot of times, and over the years, I've done quite a few of these workshops and holiday times, and not just holiday times, not just Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, that are this time of year, but New Year's Day, birthdays, anniversaries, a lot of different special occasions or anniversaries can stir up feelings, can create a pressure to feel a certain way or act a certain way, do certain celebratory things and that kind of thing. But this is really about trying to help us navigate those times. And the grief work I've done over the years, well, I'll back up a little bit. I've been at Pavillon a little over a year, but as you can probably tell, I'm not one of the youngest counselors there, but although I'm one of the newest. Have practiced as a therapist in the Raleigh area for 30-some years, and a lot of that time was working on grief and loss. And so that's where a lot of this comes from. I've done a lot of trainings and had a lot of experience. I think that really my best teachers have been the people I've worked with. And I'm going to try something. I'm a little bit more nervous because when I decide to do this, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do something, and I want to ask you to just think about, notice, observe what feelings and thoughts arise for you. Notice feelings and thoughts, especially, I think it will be easy to relate them to grief and loss. There's a grief that can't be spoken. There's a pain goes on and on. Empty chairs at empty tables. Now my friends are dead and gone. Here they talked of revolution. Here it was they lit the flame. Here they sang about tomorrow, and tomorrow never came. Then skipping just a bit. Oh, my friends, forgive me that I live and you are gone. There's a grief that can't be spoken. There's a pain goes on and on. Phantom faces at the window. Phantom shadows on the floor. Empty chairs at empty tables where my friends will meet no more. So, what about it? What kind of thoughts, feelings, maybe even images came to mind?
Resignation.
Resignation?
My dad.
Yeah, your dad.
That's the same, my dad.
Yeah.
Yeah, just thinking of, the big holiday gatherings when my grandparents were alive, great aunts, uncles, and every year that is smaller at the table.
Yeah.
Smaller. But we have some new babies coming.
Yeah. Fewer, more empty adult chairs and fewer empty high chairs, I guess. But yeah, ever since I fell in love with the musical Les Mis, when I'm doing some work around grief and loss, when I go through losses in my own life, I just can hear this song playing as the background music for my thoughts. I want to share, so the words to the song, even including some that I didn't sing, are in there. By the way, most of the photographs, possibly all the photographs you see, are photographs I took. It's one of my forms of therapy and creativity. And I love this thunderstorm and rainbow combination. The quote is from a writer named Richard Rohr. If we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it. So we've mostly heard this, the saying that hurt people. And so, yeah, a lot of times when people cause hurt to others, it's because they haven't transformed, they haven't done anything to deal with the pain, their own pain. Happens in a lot of different scenarios. Of course, working at Pavillon around addiction, a person who self-medicates and gets into addiction and substance abuse transmits a lot of pain to others and to themselves. So what the grief process, and I'll talk about grief and mourning and the difference between the two, and then we'll get to really the holiday focus part of it. But they're really processes to help us transform the pain. I'll get a little bit therapeutic with you and use a couple of important terms. And those are basically what they sound like. These are not cryptic at all. Experiential avoidance and distress tolerance. And so the more we avoid being in the present moment, the more we avoid experiencing the thoughts and feelings that are coming our way, that are generated from within us, the more we avoid experience, the more we're likely to have substance abuse issues and a variety of mental health issues. And of course, either substance abuse or mental health issues can contribute to, lead to, cause physical ailments. So lots of experiential avoidance, not healthy. Bringing down experiential avoidance is healthy. Distress tolerance is the opposite. We need more distress tolerance. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about tolerating abusive or harmful behavior. I'm talking about building up our tolerance for distressful thoughts and feelings rather than avoiding those. And like a lot of professionals who work in recovery, I am in recovery too. And so I know lots of different ways that fit with my addiction that were ways of avoiding feeling certain feelings, avoiding dealing with certain situations. I have found in recovery that there are a lot of creative ways to avoid being in touch with our present moment experience. So you already mentioned, after I asked for some thoughts, feelings, images from hearing a little bit of the song sung, but think for a moment about some more of your losses. A lot of what I say today is going to be directly related to the death of a person who's important to us. And at the same time, a lot of what I say applies to a lot of different kinds of losses. So just think for a moment, and perhaps you'll recognize some of these. Of course, death of a loved one, but also, and these aren't just when a person's in addiction and substance misuse, but death of a loved one, loss of a role, loss of a job. I discovered actually just this past fall that it being the 10th anniversary of a very painful job experience that led to my stepping away from the job, I had a lot of unresolved grief around it. And I did say that clearly. I chose to step away from the job. I'll come back to that later. Their chosen losses sometimes are seen and treated differently. But you can just see, and again, a lot of those relate specifically to addiction and substance use, but most of them can relate to just about any kind of loss. Physical abilities. I'm 62 years old, and over the last few years, I've learned a lot about losing some physical abilities and having to adapt. So what is grief? Mostly I want to normalize it. It is, like I said, it's one of the ways we transform our pain. It's normal, natural, typical. I rarely use the word normal. I find that a lot of therapists don't like the word normal, but I'm using it very intentionally. It's a normal response, often to an abnormal situation, although death and loss isn't abnormal. It's a natural part of life. But grief's also it's the psychological response to a loss. It also often includes physiological symptoms. The most obvious ones are sleep disruption and loss of interruption of appetite. But grief, because it can feel so much like depression, low energy and things like that, it also interfere with our getting healthy movement, exercise for ourselves. And it can be response to any of those kinds of losses that were on the slide earlier, or any that you could probably think about. It tends to decrease over time, and when it doesn't decrease, or at least the painful part of grief tends to decrease over time. And I'm not talking over the first week. Each day it goes down a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. It's not like that. I'm talking about over time, over months and years. And it can show up very differently for different people. That can sometimes be difficult, especially within the same family. Worked with a lot of couples where two parents were dealing with maybe the loss of a child in very different ways. And that can create a lot of let's say, interference in their ability to support each other. Obviously, things like sadness and longing to be with the person. Oops, did I? Anxiety, guilt, anger, regret. And some of those sound real obvious, and some of those we tend, in our culture, our society, tend to feel more comfortable feeling sadness around a loss. We tend to feel less comfortable feeling anger around a loss. We tend to be less comfortable feeling guilt around a loss. But all of these are very common emotions, emotional responses. And of course, emptiness is really obvious because something is taken away, whether it's chairs become empty, holes are created in our lives so often. This is a photograph I took a little lake/park in Raleigh. And there's something I've noticed that sometimes while death and decay, which is what is pictured here in this photograph, it's natural. And it can even be beautiful. And I want to suggest that there are times when the losses in our lives can also be connected with beauty, probably after a certain amount of transformation of the pain. But it's part of life that we just have to go through if we're going to keep walking on this earth. Here's a sculpture from a place in Switzerland, and something about this just really drew me when I was preparing years ago to talk about grief and loss, how sometimes we can feel like a hole has just been blown in us physically, emotionally, socially, in just about every way. I've got several quotes to share with you. To kind of do more than just give a little definition of grief. But this person, and if it doesn't have a name up there, then it's sort of an unknown origin or anonymous or probably some sort of conglomeration of what several people have said or thought. But grief is the last act of love we can give to those we loved. Where there's grief, there's deep love. Jamie Anderson is a writer who says, grief, I've learned, is just love. It's all the love you want to give but cannot. All that unspent love gathers in the corner of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and the hollow of your chest. Grief is just love with no place to go. And there's another person has said it, that grief is love looking for a home. So tell me what you see in this image. I see a blank slide. So here's another, grief has been compared to having broken ribs. And if you looked around the room tonight and someone in here had broken or bruised ribs, it's likely we wouldn't be able to tell it. They would look just fine. But with broken ribs, if you've ever had broken or bruised ribs, every breath can just be either excruciating, painful, or achy, or at least uncomfortable. And and this can certainly interfere with the support we give and get, which we desperately need in times of loss, because we look just fine. I saw Reed. How did he seem to you? He looked great to me. He looked fine. But again, deep inside, he might or might not be experiencing a lot of hurt. Washington Irving said there's a sacredness in tears. They're the messengers of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, and of unspeakable love. All these connections between grief and love, grief and love, grief and love. Sometimes all you can do, says William Hannon, sometimes all you can do is lie in bed and hope to fall asleep before you fall apart. Any of that sound familiar? Vicki Harrison, grief is like the ocean. It comes in waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm, sometimes it's overwhelming. If you've watched the ocean, or sometimes even a large lake, you can see that evolution take place. Sometimes calm, sometimes it can be overwhelming. And all we can do is learn to swim, or I would say we can learn to navigate. We can learn to navigate even the roughest waters, learn sometimes to navigate into a safe cove right by the shore until the waters calm down. This was, the first time I recall hearing this was from a woman whose husband had been taken by violence 20 years before I heard her say this. And even at 20 years later, she said, grief never ends. And she paused and she said, but it does change. And the fact that it does change is key. So I was trying to cut out quotes, but I couldn't cut out Mr. Rogers. So when we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. So when we sometimes, he starts this quote with talking about when something's unmentionable, it tends to be unmanageable. And when we make it mentionable, it becomes more manageable. The people we trust with that important talk can help us know that we are not alone. So here's a picture of me and my mother, just a little bit about my background. By the way, some of these objects up here relate to significant losses in my life. The red Christmassy looking tie is from my mother's father. I got that and a cheap little bookcase from him that probably wouldn't get a couple of dollars at a yard sale, but they are precious to me because of whose they were. The tie came from a cheap sort of what we used to call a dime store, but it is remarkably durable. I don't know what it's made of. They didn't have Kevlar back then, but there's also a bell. I was asked earlier about the bell. So my mother, before she died in October 2014, had this bad habit of falling and breaking her hip about every 2 years. And when she would do that, very conveniently one of 7 siblings. And so one of us one night, we had somebody for each night of the week, would go and stay with her because by that time my father had passed away. And if she needed to get up and go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, she would clang that bell. Again, probably a little dime store kind of an item. And for some reason, when we were going through things and deciding who would get what of my mother's property, that's not all I wanted, but I very much wanted that bell for some reason that I can't describe. Other items over there relate to grief and loss. This I'll probably pass around at some point in a bit. It's a mug that was made by a woman whose daughter was taken by violence, and I found out several months later that this woman was a potter, and I just had to have something made by her hands, knowing what she had gone through and experienced. So, different kinds of losses can impact us in different kinds of ways, but that doesn't make them any more or less of a significant loss. The amount of impact it has on us a lot of times has more to do with circumstances or our relationship with a person or things like that, and not so much about the size of the loss. My mother not only had a bad habit of falling and breaking her hip about every 2 years, about the same month every 2 years for quite a while. She also had some heart issues. In February of 2014, we all rushed to one of the emergency units in Chapel Hill at one of the UNC hospital, the main UNC hospital. The doctor saw her and said basically, there's nothing I can do to try to help her that won't make it worse. I recommend you just take her home, enjoy the time. And he even said, you might want to think about who's in the car with her on the drive home. I mean, it was like she could have dropped dead any moment. Instead, true to her character and her nature, she lasted until October, from February to October. And this is a picture of me with her. So we had like 6 months thinking that any day could be her last, any week could be her last. She was in relatively good health, mentally and physically, all things considered. And so a lot of time to tell her how much we appreciated or say goodbye, a lot of those things we don't get to do, especially when a loss is sudden. And especially when it's maybe someone I'll tell them next week how much they mean to me. And with Mama, we had that. But when she died, it was no less a significant loss. It was huge. Compare that to my brother and sister-in-law over here. So again, I'm one of 7. My second oldest brother, in October again, 2017 this time, they were in a car crash, and my sister-in-law, Vicki, died at the scene. Mike, my brother, lasted for about a week in ICU before he too died. And some people might say, if only my sister-in-law had died, it might have become something you'll learn about if you don't already know, something called disenfranchised grief, a grief that isn't as much recognized. The death of my brother was pretty much recognized, but sister-in-law, But I don't remember life without the two of them together. They were 12 years older than me. They were high school sweethearts. So I don't remember life without them. They took me to my first movie in a theater, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, back in the late 60s, I guess. So very different losses, very different losses. Which one was more? If you can figure that out, let me know. So here are the three terms. Anticipatory grief, that's really the grieving for a loss that has not fully happened yet. Might be someone like with my mother, we had this prediction that she was going to die soon. And so there's a way of beginning to grieve before the main loss actually happens, because there are lots of little losses along the way. Complicated grief is, that's a pretty simple term. There's nothing complicated about the term. It can be complicated, like I said, by perhaps a person's relationship. If my last words with someone, with my teenage daughter, were angry, I was mad at her because going out or whatever, the kind of thing, and then she goes out and she doesn't come home, that's likely going to complicate it, add to my guilt and my regret. Also, the situation can complicate it for various things. Like, I would say the car crash that took my brother when he was in his 60s was complicated for a lot of reasons that I don't have time to get into. And disenfranchised grief I was already describing. I mention it because there's so much of it. There's so much of it. I'll show you a list of some examples. I've already talked about definitions, so I'll show you a list of some examples. So this is throwing me because it's got two slides up here, and I'm not sure. I need to keep looking at the screen. I'm going to jump to this one, actually. Pet loss. That can be a really, really significant loss to people. But I wouldn't compare it to the loss of my mother or my brother. But when Stubby here died, who had been my co-worker and constant companion through the COVID epidemic, when my office was my bed and Stubby would curl up beside me, it was a big loss. It was a big loss. Pet loss is one of those that can be disenfranchised. It can be not recognized, except by other pet owners usually, as such a significant loss. But here's other examples. Say a former spouse. It can be extremely upsetting to a person when their former spouse dies, and people might think, well, you didn't want to be with them anyway, apparently, or they didn't want to be with you. But it can be complicated and disenfranchised. Any questions about any of those or any other examples? Pardon?
Miscarriage.
Miscarriage, absolutely.
My daughter has had two of them in the last few years.
And around deaths, I think sometimes the more complicated it is, the more likely people are to be very well-meaning, but say extremely hurtful and harmful things. For example, well, they might not say it to the person, but sometimes they might, but they certainly will say it off to the side. Well, at least she can have another. If the statement begins with "at least," it has no place in comforting someone after a loss. But absolutely, miscarriage. I think suicide and homicide can be disenfranchised, partly because people don't even want to deal with them, I've found. There obviously are, and fortunately are, exceptions to that, but a lot of times folks don't even want to think about it. When it's a homicide of, say, my neighbor's child or something like that, I think we our brains make up a story that tries to help our illusion that could never happen to us, that it must have related somehow to someone they did. They must have, nobody will say deserved it, but must have done something to invite it. And that is certainly a way of disenfranchising those kinds of losses.
What are some examples of chosen losses? The last one was there.
One could be after a relationship ends. There's no evidence that the person who is dropped or is broken up with, there's no evidence that that person experiences more or worse loss than the person who decided to end the relationship. That would be choosing it. In recovery, there are certain chosen losses. For our health and well-being, we choose to no longer have certain things. Sometimes people, places, things in our lives, type of lifestyles in our life. That can be another example. A couple that perhaps, or an individual even that chooses not to have children, doesn't mean it's not a loss, especially after they get maybe older and they think it's too late, and they, regret can come in there too. Those are a few examples. That y'all can probably think of others. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. We will have Q&A time, plenty of it, I hope. So grief is internal. The biggest difference, grief is internal. It has to do with the feelings and the pain, all that. Mourning is the outward expression of it. That's the biggest, most obvious difference. But the two work together to help us transform the pain and heal and continue our lives. I want to just go ahead and get to the idea that this Alan Wolfelt is one of my kind of grief gurus I go to. To mourn is to be an active participant in our grief journeys. And being an active participant in our grief journeys is one of the best favors we can do for ourselves. So examples of mourning, sending flowers, that's an act of trying to comfort someone, but it's part of the public expression. These came from Mike and Vicky's double funeral. It was a time. They were big boosters of the high school sports team, and so red and white was the school color. It's the little high school that all of us went to down in southeastern North Carolina, a place you've never heard of probably. There's a little, the vase itself is sort of a football. If you get to look a little hard to see that. The one on the right contains a lot of the things that relate to especially Mike's life. He was a farmer. There's corn, there's tobacco, two of the crops that they grew. Mike and Vicky were also fishermen, and so there's fishing rods sticking out the top, and someone did just an amazing job of designing this. And because I know that was actually Vicky's sister who did this designing, it was both probably it was grief therapy for her to design it, and it was therapeutic for I think everyone who knew Mike well. Again, there were boosters at the local high school. The local high school, it was football season in October. The local high school had a little gathering. Both teams gathered in the middle of the field, and they said some things, probably had a prayer. I was late getting there because I was out of town, and had the Bass name painted on the field. That's my, is it great nephew or grandnephew? He's Mike's grandson. My nephew's son, and who was injured, so he couldn't play that night. But it was important for the community to have a collective outward expression of the grief they were feeling. Did a balloon release. I don't remember if I mentioned that. I put this slide back in there. Unlike the blank slide, this one is in there twice that's on purpose. If we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it. You've probably heard the expression, time heals all wounds, or something like that. Absolutely disagree with that statement. Time alone heals very, very little. Time plus doing what is therapeutic, what is healing, what is comforting in some cases. Time plus doing what is needed can heal a lot. Sometimes can heal things that we don't even think is healable. Not restoring it necessarily, especially when we're talking about grief and loss and death of loved one. It's not restoring it back to the way it was before the loss, but the transformation of the pain can bring an awful lot of healing. So that brings me to another quote here. Grief is not a disorder or a disease or a sign of weakness. Three things that sometimes we think of it as. Not a sign of weakness, even for any of us, the toughest of us, the strongest of us, the way a lot of men are culturalized and socialized, sometimes they're taught that the things associated with grief are weakness. It's very unfortunate. It's an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity if we want to thrive and live well. Yeah.
So
kind of unmourned, unresolved, unaddressed grief can sometimes either be confused with depression or turn into depression and anxiety and sometimes other things. And it's tricky. Like me as a therapist, I tend to be pretty conservative when in my thinking about medication. I can't prescribe, so it's kind of a moot point, but still sometimes people want to know an opinion. And I will often say to someone, especially if they're hesitant about medication, then I might say, I'm pretty conservative about it, but it would be a good idea for you to go to a specialist, whatever kind of doctor, psychiatrist, if it's a psychotropic medication. Sometimes antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication can keep a person from grieving, I believe. Sometimes they can enable a person to function well enough so that they can grieve and live and take care of their lives. Talk therapy, and I'm in the talk therapy business, isn't necessarily the best thing for everything. Grief is one of those things that is really, really good for. There's an article called something about a story worth 1,000 tellings, and the idea of how telling and retelling helps us. Having someone witness, how it helps me a little bit every time I talk about Mike and Vicky, still, even though the point is not to help me, it does help me. So talking about it, what age person are you referring to?
14.
Okay. Yeah, by that time, if it was a younger child, it might go the direction. Some people would recommend play therapy because they're less verbal when they're younger. But a 14-year-old, that can be a tough nut for a therapist. But talk therapy can be really good, yeah. But also part of it is just self-care, physical care, just tending to the basic needs of sleep, eating, and exercise can keep a person healthy enough until they can deal with things. I think a lot of times teenagers, I don't know, maybe they think it's not cool or something, but they have a great difficulty. I can probably add to that later. We got some thoughts, and sometimes strength can be reframed. That strength isn't being stoic, strength isn't just being unaffected by something, but strength can be being strong enough to actually feel the feelings, to move toward them and into them. The way through grief and loss is through it. And before we can move through it, we've got to move to it, toward it. So it's the opposite of like what part of our brain says, pain, avoid it, Had another thought about that, but it'll come back later. While any other questions at this point before I go through a few more slides, and then we actually get to the holiday part of this thing. Helping somebody get unstuck. I think normalizing what they're going through. I can never say, I know how you feel. Even if it's someone whose brother and sister-in-law were killed in a wreck, I do not know how they feel. And it kind of cheapens what they're feeling for me to say, I know how you feel. Whether I put the, I know how you feel in front of it or not. But I can only imagine how you feel. I can't imagine how you feel. I think things like that can be a lot more helpful. Simply encouraging somebody to talk about, some people that will help. But being available. I think I took the slide out because I was taking slides out left and right to shorten this thing. But it's of a dog in one of those Elizabethan collars. You know what I'm talking about? Big old plastic thing up around its head so it can't lick or chew anything, other part of its body. And the dog's down there with that big collar on it, and there's a little kitten right down there beside him. And basically the quote's about how sometimes we just need somebody to sit with us. No preaching, no advice giving, no, I know how you feel kind of stuff, but just somebody who will be present with us in a difficult situation. There's a whole concept called companioning, which is basically about being willing to kind of be a non-anxious presence, but to be most of all a presence with someone. Some people will start talking if they're riding alongside you in the car at the moment you least expect it, but that will never happen if you're not available or somebody's not available. The only cure for grief is to grieve. which is kind of the last thing sometimes we want to do. A lot of folks who have heard about the stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And these were actually, though, based on research prior, based on anticipatory grief. That doesn't mean they aren't helpful in some way in talking after a loss, but they were mostly designed. Somebody gets a terminal illness diagnosis, going through denial, then anger, bargaining, et cetera, et cetera. What is more helpful after a loss, any kind of loss, whether it's the death of a loved one or any kind of loss, is one, accepting the reality of it, actually processing the pain. I'll show you another one in a moment that says embrace the pain. Sometimes I feel like embracing the pain's a little too much, but at least moving toward it, leaning into it, being willing to process it, adjusting to the world without that person or thing, and at the same time adjusting to the world without it or them, and at the same time figuring out what is going to be our enduring connection with that person, or in some situations that thing. This other one, it has 5 needs, but that roughly say the same thing, but these 2 things can be guides. If you ever want to kind of check yourself on your grief process, you might say, where am I in this? Am I doing this or not? Embracing the pain, remembering the person, developing a new identity. A lot of people have questions about that one, but I think of my friend who had one son taken by gun violence, the other son partly because he felt so guilty for somehow magically, miraculously not keeping his brother safe. So one son died by gun violence, this son felt guilty and regretful and all that kind of thing. Eventually died of drug overdose. And she had lost both her sons and really struggled with the question, am I still a mom? She came to the conclusion that she is, but it's still that was part of her wrestling with what's her new identity. I put those side by side just so you can kind of look at them together more easily. And whether it's another person's grief or our own, being present to it, so show up, being present to it, and also being open to it. And again, that openness goes both ways. For me to be open to and welcoming of, accepting of the pain, the grief, the anger, the sadness, the guilt, the whatever's there. Be open to it, but the opening up is also about opening up to another person. And doing what matters, that has to do with things like outward expressions of mourning, acts and words that tell the world, or tell whether it's a world of 1 or 5 or 500, but acts and words that tell the world how important that person was. Another set of 3 things, again, and this is mostly focusing on our own feelings of loss, is going toward them with courage, compassion, and curiosity. Not judgment of any kind, not, you're weak for feeling that, whatever voices from our past, our childhood perhaps, might come back to us, but to approach our own feelings of pain with courage, compassion, and curiosity. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Few both outward expressions and holiday expressions of mourning. So the photograph on the left is when I was doing a lot of work with loved ones of homicide victims, and it was something we would do about this time of year every year during the holidays. Those are white luminaries that are personalized with pictures and words and images and drawings and things glued on them and things like that to personalize them as a way of both their own individual expression in creating it, but also a public expression of not wanting their loved ones to be forgotten, to put out on this was actually on the state capitol grounds in Raleigh, where we would do this every year. This is another friend who had one son taken by gun violence, and her other son who had felt guilty for not being able somehow to prevent his brother from dying, died of a drug overdose a few years later. This was something you've probably never heard of. National Day of Remembrance for Murder Victims. It's in September, it's around September 21st, but because I was working in that realm for a while, we would have a run walk. It was more about remembering people, and we would have photographs of some, people could submit photos of their loved one at this anniversary date. It was a special occasion created to help people with their grief. These are hearts. There's an example over here with Mike and Vicky on it, but hearts where people would, again, glue pictures of their loved ones, symbols or images. One of the things Mike grew on the farm was watermelon, and so there's a watermelon slice. Again, good examples of any time in your grief journey, how these things can help. Planting a tree in remembrance is something that's really more associated not so much with holidays, but with like an anniversary. This was a tree we planted, a weeping cherry, which is both beautiful but has that bittersweetness about it, the weeping cherry, on the first anniversary of Mike and Vicky's death. This was something I stumbled upon on the Capitol grounds when I lived in downtown Raleigh. And those are shoes of people who died in vehicular accidents, wrecks, and other wrecks. And this was, again, it meant a lot to individuals to have their loved ones' shoes be a part of this display. And it's also, this awareness raising. So let's jump ahead to, I think it's really important. I think sometimes when we have hard things going on in our lives, it's almost like somebody tells us we have a right to remain silent. And sometimes anything you say can and will be used against you. But instead, I know two people. This is from Megan Devine, who has a really cool organization called Refuge in Grief. And this is her depiction of some rights, the Bill of Rights for people who are grieving and mourning, companionship, solitude, maybe two sides of the coin, to tell the truth, to cause others to be uncomfortable as a right that we have. There are a couple of other slides in your handout that go over some of the rights that we have, calls this one the Mourner's Bill of Rights. So, some general guidelines when it's holidays and special occasions. Some general guidelines are just acknowledging it up front, and openly. Acknowledging it to ourselves can be really important to say, that's what's going on with me. But also acknowledge it to others. Just kind of normalizing, it's going to be different, it's going to be messy, it's not going to be the Christmas that we would prefer, or the whatever, Thanksgiving or whatever that we prefer. Setting boundaries for ourselves, deciding what we can and can't handle, and setting some boundaries and communicating those. And also the planning ahead can be a big important part of that, but also being flexible with the planning. Maybe the plan is to go to the thing. If you go to the thing, the Christmas party or the whatever it might be, it can be helpful to have an escape plan in mind. If I come and tug on your hand one time, it means I've got to go. And maybe you have an agreement ahead of time. There's not going to be I'm having fun, can't you stay a little longer? No, if I tug on your hand, it means I need to go, and have that arranged ahead of time. If I disappear, I'm okay. It just means I've stepped outside to be by myself for a few minutes. Have some of that communicated ahead of time. Being flexible, being willing to do something different. One example of this are some friends who, the sister and daughter in the family died. And one of her favorite things was going to Disney World. And so, especially it was their first Christmas after her death, they went to Disney World. Now, they had not won the Super Bowl or anything like that. It was their way of making a different plan and actually creating what became a new tradition. Their intention wasn't to create a new tradition. It was just to do something different that reminded them of Lauren and that Lauren always enjoyed. And it became a tradition. In fact, many years when it's an annual thing now, and many years when they go to Disney World, she will post on Facebook as part of something. I'm not recommending this, but for her, it's very therapeutic and very helpful in her ongoing mourning. Dear Lauren, today we blah, 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 whatever it was. I know you would have really liked it. We really missed you. That kind of thing can be helpful. And that can be, you can apply that in so many different ways. But also it's fine, it's deciding what works for you. Be willing to follow tradition or be willing to change it. Giving yourself permission to feel whatever it is you feel. There's a lot of pressure to feel joy, hope, peace, love, which are all great things. And if we feel those, great. But maybe taking the pressure off of us that, again, it's going to be messy, it's going to be different, it's going to be complicated. And if I'm feeling sad, I give myself permission to feel sad. And I don't know. I've mentioned a couple of times the importance of just basically taking care of your body. Sleep, food, exercise. Simple hydration. Do a brief demo. Obviously, for a lot of reasons, things like alcohol can be problematic. But one of the reasons is dehydrating. And it's amazing how much good hydration can help us. So the next 3 slides have just a list of things. Just take a look at those and maybe just call out any that catch your attention or that you have a question about. Some of the things I've already talked about relate to approaching the holidays on your terms, managing expectations, having some discussions ahead of time. The whole family did the planning about going to Disney World. It wasn't just an individual. I heard there's on this a remembering ornament. So maybe that's for me, hanging a fishing lure on the Christmas tree as a memorial to my brother Mike. I've also heard like someone who just couldn't do the Christmas tree thing that had been part of their annual tradition, but that year just felt like they couldn't do it, and they turn it in instead to a connection tree. And so the ornaments had nothing to do with Christmas necessarily, or any holiday. They all had to do with just connections with that individual. It might have had my mother's cowbell on it, for example. It didn't make a star or something. I don't think that's the kind of bell that rings that angels get their wings. I don't think it sounds like that. Lighting a candle, having an empty chair. Sometimes having an empty chair at the table and going ahead with it, but that can be an honoring. Sometimes there's guilt. A lot of times there's guilt about not feeling joy, hope, peace, love. And there can be just as much, if not more, guilt for feeling some joy. Like, oh, I shouldn't be doing this because they died a month ago or a year ago or whatever, or this is the anniversary. I should feel sad. Giving yourself permission to feel what you feel. I was really surprised one year when I was doing support groups, and after New Year's, a lot of people talked about how guilty they felt starting a new year without their loved one. A lot of these we have touched on, but I don't know if any catch your attention. There's a mixture of concrete, practical things and more some emotional support kinds of things. We still, the first couple of Christmas gatherings and Thanksgiving gatherings after Mike and Vicky's death and after Mama's death, I remember we would, make a little special, say something about them. But after a few years, we didn't feel the necessity of doing anything, have a moment of silence for them. It was just a natural part of somebody might It's a very religious family, lots of praying, and so they would just mention Mike and Vicki in the prayer. You know, it was just kind of it became a natural thing. That was a part of our enduring connection with them, as well as doing the big family gathering in the building where two of my brothers, Mike and Anthony, had farmed together, and so it feels a little bit like they're present there anyway. Those things can be super meaningful. So, comments, questions, especially if there was a question you came with that you haven't heard an answer to yet. Yeah, I know I was part of a group one time that it never happened, but we kept saying it would be such a good idea to have like a potluck and everybody bring like a loved one's one of their favorite foods and put those all together. I will tell you about this fishing picture. So Mike was a fisherman, and they died November 2nd. Well, he died November 2nd. So Thanksgiving's coming up. I did not want to be around a bunch of cousins and uncles who I loved, but just didn't want to deal with that. Turned out not many of us wanted to deal with that. But I went down to the beach and went to Mike and Vicki's little kind of double wide thing at North Topsail Beach. And I asked my nephew, hey, don't you want me to check on their place? And so I'm not wearing them here, but that is his fishing rod. Part of the weekend wore his boots. And there was just something that was so powerful about that. Felt the connection. Mike was quite a prankster. He loved playing practical jokes. Actually, before I decided to take his rod and fish with it all weekend, I was just like, as we're there at their place, went back in this little canal with his rod and just threw it out. I figured that was all I was going to do. He was, back in CB radio days, his nickname or handle was Flounder King because he had caught this huge flounder once upon a time. When I threw out in that back, I caught this little tiny flounder, smaller than, well, maybe as big as my hand, if that. And it just kind of, to me, and it might not mean this to anybody else in the world, and that is all right. But to me, it was as if Mike had played a little practical joke on me. He was somewhere laughing at me. Yeah, you can keep that. No, I didn't keep that. But and looking for signs. A guy named Tommy Rosen, who founded something called Recovery 2.0, talks about in dealing with spirituality. He encourages people to keep a weirdness journal. Wouldn't be a bad idea to do as a grief thing either. This is not the photograph, but 2 years after Mike and Vicki's death, two butterflies that I had never seen that type of butterfly in my yard ever, but two of them showed up 2 years after their death. And I mean, was that totally a coincidence or there's a practical explanation? I don't care. To me, it meant something. A woman whose daughter died, her daughter had a turtle tattoo. Every time she sees a sister, where did that come from? Every time she sees a turtle, she feels like it's a connection with her daughter who had the turtle tattoo. So as a balloon, that balloon launch at the football field way back when in the presentation, believe it or not, it's a little hard for me to believe, but one of those balloons went 8 miles over the treetops. One of those balloons landed in the yard of the house where we grew up. It was just like mind-blowing. I don't care if you think I'm a little crazy or whatever. But a lot of times, one of actually the special things about being willing to be with and talk with someone about their grief and loss, like even the person you were talking about earlier who's stuck, is sometimes people will tell you stuff once they feel like you're safe and trustworthy and are going to honor their pain and their memories. They'll tell you things they won't tell anybody else. That's you.